Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you don't know me, my name is Sarah, and in today's video we are going to be putting our appas together. So you're going to need the nearly finished body from last tutorial. So we finished the feet, the tail, so all we have left for the body is the belly. And then we also have our head. We will be attaching the head today, so make sure you have your head finished and ready to go. For the material list you will need scissors, 2 different types of sewing needles, or just one, it doesn't really matter. So I have my short one and my long one, and of course you'll need your crochet hook, the same one we've been using this entire time. For yarn colors, we're going to need our lighter gray and a little bit of cream to attach the head. And then, this is an optional step, but we will need some wire. So I will simply be using this for the tail today. If you want to build the whole wire frame for him, you guys can go ahead and do that. If you want to omit the wire, you can do that as well. I will just be putting this wire in the tail, so I shaped it in a U shape, and then I will secure these tips so they can't poke out, which I'll show you in just a minute how to do if you decide to use wire. I also get this wire from any craft store. It's just basic flower wire. It doesn't really matter how heavy it is. If it's too thin, like mine is a little thin, you can always double it like I am going to do for today's video. And then you will need stuffing. You're going to need a lot of stuffing, so make sure you have a good amount on hand. The goal for this is to stuff the tail lightly, because you don't want to stuff it so that it rounds out like this. You want to make sure it lays flat. So stuff the tail lightly enough that it holds its shape, but not enough that it balloons out. Hopefully that makes sense. I will be putting the wire in the tail so that the wire is on the bottom of the tail. That way, if anyone wants to move it around, you don't see the wire on the top of appa. So for example, I would just push it in here, right after stuffing, right between the stuffing layer and the, obviously the bottom of it all. Completely lost track of what I was gonna say. Now we're gonna have to secure these so that they don't poke out at any point in time. So I'm actually gonna go get a pair of pliers for this. You can use your fingers if you want. I just don't. I like to get nice and tight, and you can't really do that with your fingers. So give me just a second. I'm gonna just go get my needle nose that I normally use for other things, and it'll work out just fine. All right, I have returned with some very basic pliers. So what we're gonna do is just curl these ends in on themselves. And with all the stuffing that's going to be in here, it doesn't really matter which way it faces. All this does is make sure that this end won't poke anyone if it ever manages to find a way out. There, I have the wire in the tail. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to stuff the legs, and you want to stuff them really nice and hard. If you want to have flatter feet, you could put some cardboard in the bottom, or even some marbles or something, like the flat marbles. Definitely don't put any of this stuff in it if it's going to a kid. Only do this if it's going to be sitting on a shelf or for an adult, just because for safety reasons. And once all your legs are stuffed, we can actually stuff the body. Now, when we sew the belly piece on, we'll actually be able to stuff a bit more. So don't worry too much about like stuffing the very edge of the legs. We'll get to that again when we do the belly. Right now, I'm actually just going to wait until the belly is finished before I stuff the body hard. When there's a lot of stuffing coming out, it'll be difficult to sew the belly on, so it's better to wait. I will wait, and we're gonna start with the belly piece. So we're actually gonna be making two separate pieces. The one that closes this gap, and then a separate piece for the tail. So we're gonna start with this because it'll actually be easier to sew this part on when the whole thing is finished. Go ahead and set this aside for now, and we're going to crochet that belly piece real quick. For that, you're gonna use your light gray yarn, and you're gonna pull out a length of yarn. You're gonna leave a nice long tail. So you're actually gonna leave a long tail on both ends of this because I can guarantee we'll need both sides nice and long. So just create a slip knot onto your hook, and we're going to chain 12. Once you've chained 12, you're going to turn your work, and you're actually going to skip that first chain here, and we're going to decrease the next 2 chains. And you're going to single crochet in the next 7 chains. And then with those last 2 chains, we're going to decrease. Now we're going to chain 1 and turn our work, and in back loop only. So for this round and every round after, we're just going to be crocheting in the back loop only. For this round, we're going to single crochet 3. We're going to decrease. And then single crochet in the next 4 stitches. Here we are. Here's what it's looking like so far. Now we're going to chain 1, turn, and single crochet in the back loop for each of these stitches. And you're actually going to repeat this round for 25 rounds total, counting this one. here is the belly finished. So it'll look very small right now, but we're actually going to be stretching it out when we sew it on. So go ahead and chain one and fasten off with a long length of yarn. And now we can begin sewing this onto the body. I'll be using my extra long needle for this, but feel free to use whichever needle works best for you. I'm going to begin with this smaller end. So we have the end where we decreased, and then we have the end where we just fastened off. That is the end that I have threaded onto my needle. So now what we're actually going to do is sew this to the tail portion, and again it's going to look real small, but what we're going to do is we're going to stitch every extra stitch here to one of the stitches on the belly, so there'll be no overlap. So for every part of this sewing, one stitch goes to one stitch of the body. We don't skip any stitches or anything. So I'll begin by inserting my needle into the tail and then stitch this on. There we have one side of the belly stitched on. So now I'm actually going to start going down the legs towards the front of the body. At this point, I'm going to tie these two ends together and tuck the shorter one into the body and continue working with the longer end. With Appa, you want everything to be quite stiff except for the tail, which we talked about in the beginning. You want it to lay flat, but everything else should be very stiff. So I'm going to start securing this other side the same way we did, but I will be stuffing about halfway through and then when it's mostly sewn on as well. So at this point, just sew and stuff as needed. And here we are with the belly fully sewn on. So as you could probably tell, that was a lot of stuffing that went into Appa. So when you stuff Appa, make sure that you stuff him nice and hard, especially if you're doing it with a figurine or like a shelf piece in mind. If you're doing like a plushie, it's not necessary to stuff it as hard. If you have a little bit of splay leg like mine does, don't worry, we're actually gonna fix that in this next step. But before we do that, we're just going to secure this end with a knot and weave it right into the body. And for the next step, we're going to use some cream yarn, and there's a couple optional things here, but if you're getting a little bit of splay leg like mine does, what we're gonna do is we're actually going to bring the legs together, and we're just going to like stitch inside the body to bring them together. Now you can also do the same shaping technique with the tail. So what you would do is stitch down here, pull it tight, and it'll bring it down. I have wire in my tail now, so I can actually shape it to sit the way I want it to. That's the reason why I put wire in the tail, so that I can do this with it. But like I said, you can shape it with some string. It doesn't really matter what it looks like because we'll put the arrow on top and the belly on the bottom. So if you're dealing with a little bit of splay leg like I am, we're going to shape the legs a little bit more. So the easiest way to do this is with your long needle. If you don't have one, then you can use the short needle. It'll just test your patience a little bit more. So what we're gonna do is we're going to thread our needle, and we're going with the cream yarn, of course, and we're going to insert our hook into one of the legs, and we're gonna come out in about the other side of the leg. And then we're going to take this end, and we're going to like pick up a stitch as we go, otherwise this won't work. And we're gonna go to the front side of the other leg across from it. And we're going to pick up a stitch here, go straight across the leg to the other side of the leg. Pick up another stitch and then go across to the other leg on the other side, so the leg we haven't done yet. And when you pull these two ends tight, you'll see it kind of sink in a bit more and keep the shape still, but help bring it in a little bit more. It'll all come together a little bit better when we get all the legs finished as well. So just go ahead and repeat this process for all of the legs. And when you finish, you're going to take the end all the way back to the other side where the other end is. And now you can begin the shaping. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull the legs together and hold them, and then with that end we can just tighten them up a bit. And you could do this with both sides. As you can see, it sits much better. It's not perfect, but it sits much better. And once you've tugged it enough and you're happy with the way it sits, you're going to tie these two ends together. That might have been a little too tight. It's okay. And you can trim both these ends and weave them in. Don't be afraid to use your hands to shape the belly back into shape as well. Since we're smushing it a little bit, it will be a little bit more rounded, but honestly, it's not too noticeable. And it is worth it to get the legs to sit better. So as you can see, they sit better. Now, if your appa leans back on itself, don't worry, that will actually level out when we put the head on, because the head will bring it forward and make it sit like this. Go ahead and weave this end in, and when we are finished, we will work on the underside of the tail. Go ahead and set your nearly finished body aside, and we're going to work on the underside of the tail. This is the same process that we did for the belly. You're going to use your light gray yarn, leave a length of yarn on both sides. But for the tail, we're actually going to be chaining 23. You're going to skip that first chain and single crochet in each of the chains. So you'll have 22 single crochets when you finish this row. You're going to chain one and turn your work. And now for the next 24 rounds, we're going to single crochet in each of these stitches, and we'll also be crocheting in the back loop only. These single crochet rounds are going to take a little while, so I'm actually going to do the rest of them off camera. But do not fasten off. When you finish the single crochet rounds, we have a couple more rows after those single crochet rows. So I will see you in just a second. Here is what the underside of the tail looks like once you have finished all of your single crochet rounds. For this next row, we're going to decrease 3 times all in the back loop. And I'll just be using the regular decrease for this. Then we're going to single crochet 10. And now we will decrease 3 times. And there's the end of that row. It's starting to get a little bit of curve. So this part here is going to be the end of the tail. For the next row, we're going to decrease 3 times again and stay in the back loop only. We're going to single crochet in the next 4 stitches. And then we are going to decrease 3 more times. There's the end of that row. So now we're going to chain 1, we're going to turn, and we're going to decrease 2 times, again in the back loops only. We're going to single crochet in the next 2 stitches. And then we will decrease 2 more times. Now we're going to chain 1 and fasten off, leaving a long tail for sewing. And there we have the underside of the tail finished. So for the next step, we're actually going to sew this piece on. And then once we get this piece attached, we'll attach the head. To begin, you're going to thread your needle on the flat side. So the slip knot end, if you will. And we're going to start stitching across. Now you want to stitch right up against the leg. And make sure that you sew this to the gray part so there's no cream in between. So there's no gap. Because we did some shaping, things are a little bit rounder, but still shove it in there and stitch it attached to the gray part. And now what we're going to do is we're going to stitch the sides down, and this one you don't pull as tight as the belly, so don't try and stretch it around, just sew it nice and flat against the tail. finished, go ahead and tie a knot and then weave the tail into the body. There we go, and go ahead and weave in any remaining ends as well. There we have the body almost finished, but the structure is done. So now we're going to attach the head, and the way we do this is by using some cream yarn. So go ahead and thread your needle. I'll be using my larger one for this. Now you want to find the place where Appa's head sits the best. So whether you want it lower or higher. So I'm going to sew it on about there. If you have sticks or knitting needles, you can use those to secure the head in place. These knitting needles are pretty thick. I don't think I want to use them just because they will stretch the stitches. But if you have something similar to this that's thinner, I recommend metal, not wood, because wood will pull out the stuffing. You can use that to hold the head in place. Traditional pinning won't work because this head is so big. But I'm going to sew it on to where the head is about level with the hump on the body. And then you don't want to sew the neck too thick, so you don't want to come all the way out here and stitch it across, because then the head sits a little weird. So I'm just going to start at the top here. So I'm going to join my end into the body first. Pull a nice long tail, and then I'm going to stitch 2 rounds above that border thing that we did, the fringe, I guess you could call it. So here's where I would make sure I like where it sits, that it's centered. And then I will begin stitching across. just going to drop this end and start working with the other end and going the other direction. That way I can make sure the head stays centered. I have to say, sewing the head on is the hardest part, but if you've made it this far, you should be able to do it. Like I said earlier, don't be afraid to rip the whole thing off and start again if you don't like it. But once you are satisfied, you can just trim those ends, secure them together with a few knots, and then weave them in. And then our arrowless appa will be finished. So in the next part, I'll show you how to do the arrow. But before you go, I do have to say, if you decide to brush it, the best time to brush it would be before you put the belly and the arms on, or the head when it's just like the base of the head, just because you're not brushing out the gray parts of the body or the horns, the cheeks, and stuff like that. But if you do change your mind and decide you want to brush it, you can also brush it now. And now would be the time to, like, your last chance to brush it. Because next video we'll be putting the arrow on, and depending on which method you use, you won't be able to brush it, or you won't necessarily like the look of it brushed. But here is our appa almost nearly complete. I'm actually going to get a sticky roller and get all the fuzz off of him. But here's what he's looking like so far. You've got the head, the neck is attached now, the body. For some reason my head turned out a little bit bigger than my past appas. I'm curious if that has to do with the fact that I switched hooks halfway through, because the squeaking of the original hook was driving me insane. So I think that probably has to do with that. Proportionally, I think it balances out just fine. Thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. If you have started your appas and you're nearly done, definitely let me know down in the comments. I need to hear about your experience with this pattern so far. I know it's quite big and it's a lot of work, but I do think it turns out really awesome. Definitely let me know your thoughts. And thank you so much for following the tutorial and for trusting me to release them all too. We are getting there. We have one more part. We have to put the arrow on and then we are finished. So give yourself a pat on the back if you made it this far. And I will see you in my next tutorial. Bye!